Caesar de Bello Gallico, Book 4, Chapter 24. So Caesar, heading over to Britain, was finally assembled around 3 p.m. And hoping for a safe arrival, was sorely disappointed. But the barbarians, ablative absolute, with the plan of the Romans having been known, with cavalry having sent before and charioteers, two ablative absolutes clause, by that which. Now handle relative adjectives for Caesar, try that which, and then see what you need to do. By that which kind they were accustomed, right? And generally ablative, present infinitive, passive of the deponent verb to use. That explains why quo genere is ablative. It's the object phrase in battles. So, and the charioteers having been sent forth in battle, having been sent forth along with the cavalry, very swift, having followed, who's having followed? The barbarians. With the remaining forces, they were prohibiting our guys to come out. A present infinitive passive of a deponent verb form. Therefore, it's a complement clause. They were prohibiting that our guys go out from the ships. This would be ablative separation or source phrase from the X in the infinitive. There was the greatest difficulty on account of these matters. Why? Causal clause, because the ships were able not to be stood or placed, not to be stood, I think is not to stand, except in the deep. That means the ocean. The ships were not able to be beached. They were so big. But there must be a jumping off. Notice the future passive participle gerundive of obligation with erat. But it was needing to be jumped out of. And at the same time, from the ships, they must be stood. There must be a standing in the waves. So at the same time, they've got to jump out from the ships, and there must be a standing in the waves, and there must be a fighting with the enemies by our soldiers. So they got to go wade out in the deep. They got to fight deeply. They got to jump out. So we have some fun stuff. So we have by our soldiers, and then we have these other things here. So let's start with the places having been unknown or in unknown places, with hands entangled, having been oppressed by the great and heavy load of armor. Now, what's the presses referring to? Clearly, these are separate ablative absolute clause. But what's the presses referring to? It's referring to the militibus. What case is the militibus? Dative of agent with a gerundive of obligation. That you add you take the erat here and it keeps on going. That's kind of fun. So, and there must be a fighting by our soldiers with the enemies, in unknown locations, with hands encumbered, and our guys impressed or pressed down from premi with a great and heavy load of armor. When they out either or, they might hurl, or when they were hurling, could be a subjunctive in a cum clause. When they were either hurling or their darts. Now, who's they? Different than the soldiers. That would be the British. And let's play with that when in a second. When they were either hurling their darts, their spears boldly out from dry land, or having progressed a little bit into the water with their they having been prepared or having been expediti means they were lightly armed. They were able to be moving with all their limbs, means phrase, in well-known locations, opposite of ignotis. And when they were urging on their horses, having been insifactos accustomed. Well, so you see a comparison between what our poor Roman soldiers were having to do and what the British were able to do. Therefore, expediti, progressi, that refers to illy. So how do we handle the cum? Do we handle it as when, because, since, although? I'd say since, as because of this fact. And they were urging on their horses. So this is the opposite of the Romans. With which things, so therefore let's look for your verb here. Perteriti. What's another verb? I think another verb here would be imperiti. That's a nice sound. Utabantur. And that utabantur would be useful. Let's play with that one. By which things our guys, having been terrified and having been unskilled altogether of this sort of fighting, all utabantur were using not, that takes the ablative as the subject phrase, not the same speed and zeal that in that which they had been accustomed, complement clause, to use in foot infantry battles or foot battles. So in this first chapter 24, Caesar talks about the very difficult arrival on Britain. He's dealing with the British who, having found out the plan of the Romans to land, they had set forth their night cavalry and chariots, so they had speed in which they were accustomed to generally to use in battles, these chariots, which we'll talk about in the next readings. They followed closely, right, with their remaining forces. They were prohibiting complement clause. There was the greatest difficulty on account of these causes because the ships were able not to weigh anchor, not to stand unless in the deep. However, though there was the ships were in the anchor, it was necessary to jump out at the same time from the ships. There was a necessary to be stood at the same time in the waves, and there was a necessary to be stood at the same time, to be fought at the same time by our soldiers with the enemies. And our poor soldier boys, they were in unknown locations. They had their hands full, and they were oppressed by a great and heavy load of armor. When, on the other hand, this is contrastive, those guys, not our guys, those guys, the British, either were hurling, this is why it's subjunctive, it's a cum clause, their spears boldly off of the dry land on the beach, or having progressed just a little ways into the water. They were expediti, unlike our guys who were impediti. They were swift of foot in all their members, with their location known, and they were urging on their accustomed horses. So it's an interesting battle for Caesar. It's one that's exciting because it is approaching how to get a land force onto dry land. And in all things, Excelsior.